The Rance series has been one that has piqued my interest for quite a while, with a ridiculous concept of Rance being a horny dickhead and wanting to fuck almost every woman in each game to the point of not really caring how they themselves feel about it, having a huge ego, and not giving a shit about what anyone thinks. You'd think this would be a one-off funny meme game or something. However, quite the opposite is what happened. The Rance series had a long-ass runtime, with 10 mainline games, quite a few spin-offs, and remakes of the first 3 games. Not to mention, some of the main things that fans love about this series is not just the hot girls, though they are pretty hot, but the pretty deep lore and storytelling throughout the series, fascinating world building, super lovable casts, and the character development they receive game to game, banger OSTs, and hell, even pretty great gameplay in certain titles. Although completely different in nature, the similarity of being a long-running series of characters and side stories that continue throughout each title, and a pretty impressive and deep world or setting to go along with it, is what drove me to try out the Trails or Kiseki series. While I haven't played through all of them yet, not to mention it's still an ongoing series, I'm already a huge fan of the games I've played, with one of them being among my favorite games of all time, Trails in the Sky Second Chapter. So something with that kind of vibe is already pretty interesting to me. So let's fast forward a little bit. In December last year, I beat Rance I, The Quest for Akari, which is a remake of the first game in the series. For what it was a pretty fun time. The comedy and dialogue in the game is pretty fantastic, not to mention the art is rather high quality. I wasn't personally the biggest fan of the battle system, and there being so many missable CGs or items that the game doesn't warn you about is something I'm not a big fan of, but the overall character interactions and dialogue was enough for me to still have a pretty good time. My impression of the game was most certainly good, but not super high enough to immediately binge the next game, so I ended up taking a bit of a break due to tackling other things higher on my priority list. But this month I was finally driven with the motivation to return to the Rance series. I didn't particularly want to replay the remake of the first game, as it's about a 15-hour game and doesn't really offer much in the way of replayability, so I set to try the good old original Rance I, which is pretty easy to get a hold of thanks to becoming officially freeware by Alisoft. It's also really short. While your length of time might differ whether you use a guide or not, it's still a game I can say you'd be comfortably within 3 to 5 hours, or even less. And let me say, it's a pretty goofy experience. It honestly made me appreciate the remake even more. A lot of the main meat and interactions I thought were hilarious were just simply not present. The art is so goofy looking that you can't help but laugh. The gameplay is also rather middling. But all that being said, it still has its fair share of goofiness that was pretty damn funny to read. Considering I was able to beat it in one sitting, it was a fun time, and I definitely wouldn't consider it a waste. There's definitely a type of novelty being able to experience how it all started. For those unaware, the original Rance I came out in 1989. For something else to reference how old that is, Final Fantasy I came out in 1987. That means Rance I is over 30 years old. It had its 33rd anniversary this June. That's pretty crazy. After going through Rance I, I decided to finally tackle Rance II, The Rebellious Maidens, which is a remake of the second game. Rance I seemed to take more liberties with the game by adding a lot more content and dialogue and making each one a lot better. This resulted in almost every character becoming more memorable and distinct, even characters you wouldn't normally think of as memorable in some other JRPGs, such as the owners of the various shops. Not to mention the gameplay and map or dungeon elements being completely different. Rance II, on the other hand, is a bit more akin to a remaster rather than a full-on remake. Rance II, on the other hand, is a bit more akin to a remaster rather than a full-on remake. While the art quality and music are much better, the dungeons and how they work are all the same from the original, but maybe some slight changes here and there. The original version of Rance II also had the same script as the original game, but there's a secondary version called Rance II Kai that changes up the script to be a bit more similar to the energy of Rance I. The gameplay is also pretty bad. While not the worst I've ever experienced, the dungeons are clunky and progression is weird and often unintuitive. While Rance I wasn't guilt-free of this either, this game is especially bad in that aspect, not to mention having to deal with random encounters in the respective dungeons. The visuals for these dungeons are also rather unimpressive. Battles themselves are okay enough, but they're nothing worth writing home about. It's definitely something I recommend you use a guide for so you can get through it as quickly as possible. So while the gameplay itself is pretty bad, the story, character interactions, and aesthetic of the game are all at least pretty enjoyable. The plot has a bit more substance than Rance I, and Rance is still as hilarious as ever. The new characters are all pretty fun, and seeing how they all respond to Rance's bullshit is great. Not to mention Shizuka is hot as fuck. Wait, oops. I did know beforehand that this is probably one of the weakest entries regarding the gameplay, so I did at least go in with pretty low expectations. Compared to 01 and even the original Rance 1, I wish they kept this game as an actual plain old visual novel rather than including the dungeons or any RPG element, as it's definitely the worst aspect of the game. Now, let's get to Rance III, Fall of Laces, the main game I want to talk about in this video. As you might be able to tell by the title, I played the original Rance 3 rather than the remake. As of now, the remake is unfortunately not available in English yet. On July 4th, Manga Gamer did announce that they're picking up the game, meaning that it'll eventually be out in English. This is super exciting, and I'm definitely looking forward to it, but it's still gonna be a hot minute till that's actually out, and I don't really want to wait until then. So, while I'm definitely going to check out the remake once it's localized, I decided to tackle the original in the meantime. So, without further ado, let's finally get into talking about this game. First of all, the aesthetic. While going from 02 to this game definitely had a bit of a shift in art, both from a style perspective as well as some character designs themselves, I honestly really dig how this game looks. I'm not going to pretend that everything looks amazing. Some proportions are definitely a bit scuffed, but it has such a cute and lovable 90s charm to it. From the character sprites you see in the town sections, to the small character faces in the corner when they speak, to the various character CGs, as well as the little character portraits you see in battles. It's all pretty aesthetically pleasing to me. While I'm not going to say I prefer this art in comparison to the more modern art in the remakes, I still think this game looks pretty nice in its own right, which definitely motivated me to keep going. While the music here definitely has a more older feel compared to the remakes, as it's more similar to the 16-bit era music, I still really enjoyed it. Not only do they all fit their respective dungeons and moments in the story, they're also just really damn catchy. Throughout the video, I'll play some of my favorites too, so you can get a feel for it. On to honestly the thing that probably surprised me the most, the gameplay. I consider this game to be definitely a big step up in gameplay in comparison to Rance 2 and the original Rance 1. It's more debatable whether it's better than Rance 1's gameplay. I can definitely understand if you prefer it over this, but for me, I much preferred the gameplay here. I enjoyed the feeling of exploring the dungeons more here, and the town sections are a bit more simplified, so figuring how to progress the plot is far more manageable, and I never felt truly stuck. The combat system is more similar to a tactical RPG. All your characters spawn into the battle, and you're able to move Rance and have him attack, use items, and so on. Instead of an MP system or something, what this game has is a stamina meter. Each attack and spell uses up a certain amount of stamina. If a move costs more stamina than the character currently has, the user must rest in order to gain more. However, what's notable about this game is that the rest of your party are all controlled by AI. Depending on the character and class they have, they'll either just automatically run in and charge to attack, or use various healing and damaging spells that they have. There's two main types of damaging spells in this game, either stronger single target ones or weaker ones that hit everyone on the map. The healing spells change how much they heal in regards to user's level, but even at a low level, which the game encourages you to stay at, the HP it gives is good enough, and the AI is very good about spamming heal enough to keep your characters alive. Plus, worst case, Rance can use items on himself or other characters too. This game also happens to have an auto battle option. Although your turn ends normally after you move or attack with Rance, as the rest are controlled by AI anyways, it's still a nice option to mindlessly get through weaker mobs, or just save you from clicking the same things over and over again. Although I said this game was more similar to a tactical RPG, outside of one fight, first, this game is quite easy and doesn't really require any type of strategy to get through, though not like a bunch of strategy would be available with mostly AI members anyway. Because of this, just clicking auto battle is a nice and simple way to get through. Another interesting feature is that outside of mini bosses or standard bosses, and a certain enemy type later in the game, you have a 100% chance to escape from everything. So if you happen to run into an enemy at a bad time or something, you'll be perfectly fine. While AI party members might sound like it'll be a frustrating experience, it's honestly very fine. Although I did personally have some issues with a certain ninja character running in and getting hurt too much sometimes, for the most part, with a combination of broken strong equipment options for your characters, weak enemy quality, and a strong broken demon character available who's able to cheese everything up until the very end of the game, you're basically never going to run into problems until the final dungeon, outside of maybe one other section. Even then, instead of final dungeon, Everything up to the second to final boss is still pretty easy and manageable, even with these AI party members. Don't get me wrong, I don't think this battle system is perfect or anything. It feels like you don't have much impact outside of a few situations, since it's not like anything you do will change how the AI acts. There's not really a lot of depth to find here. Despite this, I still find it to be fine enough to go through. Compared to O2, battles don't really feel like a chore or some tedious thing to deal with, even with random encounters. Plus, I can't lie, I'm a huge sucker for just seeing the funny battle dialogue from the various enemies and the cute character portraits that show up in the middle. All in all, the battle system kept me entertained enough to get through the game. Next are the dungeons and overall dungeon layout design. While there's some questionable things in a few areas, I find that for the most part, the design is fine enough. Compared to O2, exploring and getting around is a lot more straightforward. This game still has its fair share of missable CGs and items, as well as some kind of annoying points of no return sections which can be a bit lame at times. But even with those flaws, I still find it to be a pretty nice experience. Exploring the dungeons with their catchy tunes is just plain fun. It's a comfy game to play, and honestly, considering how old it is, a pretty lax experience is fine by me. If there's any problem I have with the gameplay, it's the second to final boss. While the rest of the game is pretty simple enough to get through, even at your base level 10, the second to final boss comes out of nowhere to fuck everything up. I'd be more fine if a challenging boss of the game up to then build up to it, but he comes out of literally nowhere like this. I got through most of the game at level 10 in order to maximize the amount of EXP you gain, as the EXP you obtain for the whole party scales through Rance's level. While this may sound challenging, it's really not. As I mentioned before, the enemy quality is pretty low the whole way through. Equipment basically makes up for no levels, and the AI members are competent enough to carry you throughout the game. Plus, you're able to get an item that lets you summon an extremely powerful demon at the beginning of each fight. This demon has 500 HP and is able to one or two shot things for the vast majority of the game. Even bosses she's able to melt at a fast rate. However, even if you don't obtain this item, you're still able to summon her at the cost of using up Rance's turn and all his stamina, which is still very worthwhile. So with this, I was able to get through fairly easily, and at the end right before this boss, I was able to get all the way to level 43. This would absolutely stomp every other encounter in the game, and it wouldn't even be close. But against this boss, even with a bunch of healing items and a completely stacked squad, I just barely managed to scratch by, all due to luck of him not targeting Rance the whole time. Even with such busted stats at the end, it all came down to luck basically. That's pretty lame. Not to mention, if you lose, there's a long unskippable scene of battles between NPCs and the boss, which takes forever to go through. While the scene is fine by itself, having to sit through it over and over again, a realistic possibility due to the absurdly strong boss, is rather unfortunate. It's definitely a real flaw, but I'm willing to overlook this just because I had such a comfy time with the rest of the game. Now, onto the main meat of the game and my real favorite aspect of it, the story and character interactions. I brought it up both for O1 and O2, that they both have pretty fantastic character interactions, even if the plots themselves aren't super interesting. And as you can expect, Rance 3 is no exception. To start off with, Rance is just an extremely hilarious protagonist, and it's always a joy to see him interact with literally anyone. Like literally, the game starts off with him claiming, "How dare the sun wake him up? Doesn't it know who it should be thankful for?" It's no secret that Rance is not a great person, but his dialogue is just far too funny for me to care. This is also in part to his dynamic with Sil and the way they interact with each other. Although some of the characters have dealt with Rance's shit in the first two games, Sil's previous history of him and knowing him for longer has basically numbed her to all his shit. Rance pulls the dumbest shit out of his brain and Sil would just go along with it, and it's absolutely hilarious every time. It's hard to put into words just how great it is. It was hilarious in the first two games despite them having to spend a lot of time away from each other in game. And in this game there's even more of it, as outside of one decently short dungeon, they're together the whole time. This results in basically a whole game of their incredible interactions, leading it to be even better than the first two games for that aspect alone. But even beyond the dynamic between Sil and Rance, Rance's interactions are just great with all the other characters too, including random NPCs to more relevant side characters, and then everyone in the party. Even his monologues are so fucking great. For the actual story itself, I was honestly pretty impressed. While I imagine that 03 adds a lot more meat to it and makes it an even more memorable story, for what's here, it's honestly really good. For one, I feel like the scale of the story is much greater compared to the first two. While the second game's story isn't bad in that aspect, I find it to be much more interesting here. As you can tell by the title of the game, the whole introduction of the game shows that the Kingdom of Laces, where a good portion of the first game takes place, is captured, and the Princess Leia and her bodyguard Maris are taken hostage. The only one who escapes out of this event is Leia's ninja bodyguard or servant, Kanami, as Leia lets her escape so she can inform Rance and ask for his assistance. What's notable about this is that these three characters played a major role in the first game, and then briefly showed up to assist Rance in the second game. This has allowed for the player to be familiar with them already, even if in the first game they played their roles as bad guys. I'm already a fan of this for two reasons. For one, the Land of Laces is one that not just Rance, but we too are familiar with, leading us to want to rescue it not just for the endgame reasons, but because hey, these guys don't deserve this shit. Plus, it's the beginning of characters getting more screen time and becoming more enjoyable to experience, even if they don't really have any sort of character development yet. But it's fine that they don't develop yet, not just because I know there's so many games afterwards, but more so because their interactions and dialogue are still pretty damn great in the meantime. I didn't really feel anything about this trio originally for most of the first game beyond, well, they do have nice designs. But after the ending of the first game, their brief interactions in the second game, in this game, I'm already becoming a fan of Kanami, and Leia's a fucking hilarious character. Leia's complete obsession with Rance is actually so good. The whole scene of Leia showing the party her room in the castle is one of my favorite scenes in the whole game. She even has a fucking body pillow of Rance on her bed. And how does the cast react? So just simply responds, I want one too. I can always appreciate Kanami playing the more straight man role in regards to Rance's bullshit too. And what's even more exciting about this, even if it's not an inherent property of the game itself, is that I know these characters have become even greater. As I mentioned earlier, one of the most beloved things about the Rance series is the actual character development and how they change throughout the games, which I'm so looking forward to. Alright, I got kinda sidetracked about those characters, so let's go back to the story. I don't want to get into anything too spoilery, so I'll keep most stuff past the intro a bit brief. After the introduction, the game starts with Rance waking up in his house, realizing that he and Syl are poor as fuck and need to accept more jobs despite his hatred for his boss. Kanami arrives and begs for Rance to help save the princess, and while at first he's very reluctant, he manages to accept after agreeing with getting 70% of Liz's funds and treasures and making Kanami agree to having a ton of sex with him as a reward. Simply incredible. As the journey continues, Rance continues to meet up with characters from the previous game, including the main witches introduced and a demon named Felis. Her story in particular is fucking funny, so seeing her come back is pretty great. I'm hopeful that she'll continue to have a consistent role throughout too. To cover it here, in 02, Rance accidentally summons a demon, and this demon being Felis. She tells him that he can have free wishes, with the only caveat being that he can't ask for more wishes, and that she'll take his soul when he dies. So, what does Rance wish for first? Of course, he wishes to fuck this shit out of her. While she's a bit reluctant, she goes along with it. After the following age scene, Rance then attempts to wish to have sex again. This time, however, the party begs for him not to, and instead to wish for a peach apple, as they need one for the main quest. So, naturally, she gives him one. For his final wish, Rance decides to ask her to take back the cost of her taking his soul when he dies, basically meaning he gets off scot-free. This leaves her fucking shocked and humiliated, which is absolutely hilarious to read. This high-ranked specialized demon got destroyed by this horny asshole. What's not to love? So anyway, she comes back in this game, and due to her rank being lowered by getting fucked over by Rance in the previous game, he pulls some shit to become her master, which is why he's able to summon her in each battle. Her reactions to all this is hilarious and definitely one of the many highlights of the game. His influence is incredible. From there on, Rance eventually comes to lead the army, out of his selfish will of course, teaming up with the witches and former comrades in the second game, so that they can save Princess Leia and save the Kingdom of Laces. The way I describe this story might not make it sound too interesting, but I promise it's a really fun time. I hope the footage in the background can help convince you too. And what I personally really enjoy about it is also that it's slowly starting to divert from the first two games in terms of writing. In Rance 1 and 02, Rance's asshole tactics and behavior are painted more so as comedy or even heroic in certain instances, and he doesn't really face any true repercussions for it. Which I don't really mind, don't get me wrong, it's pretty damn funny. But in this game, Rance's actions start to actually have major consequences at times, which leads to being pretty interesting as the story unfolds, and also how the game ends as well. However, on the flip side, his arrogance and strategies are also shown in a good light too, showing that he's not just a good warrior, but one who can actually accomplish things as well. It makes me really excited to continue trying each game, as I'm pretty sure that the writing and interactions are going to get better and better with each entry. So, that's my thoughts on Rance 3, without going into all the spoilery details about it. While I didn't expect much from this game, I got a surprisingly fun dungeon crawling game, a pretty enjoyable story to boot, a banger OST, and some fucking hilarious character interactions. All in all, a pretty damn good package. Definitely one of the more positive things I've experienced this year. I figured from here on, it'd be pretty fun to make a video on my experience on each Rance game. This is a series I'm super excited to continue going through, and I can't wait to see how each game gets better and better. This was pretty long, but it was a lot of fun talking about this game, and my experiences with the previous Rance games too. While I primarily wanted to gush about it all, it'd be cool if I convinced anyone else who was maybe on the fence of trying it to start this series too. Thanks for watching!